Okay, can you hear me? Hello. Let's settle down, class. I'm Jerry Muller, and I've spent the last hour or so frantically cutting back my talk as the former speaker headed to his time, so I'm going to be brief. This is called the two pluralisms, adumbrations and emendations. Peter Berger's The Many Altars of Modernity is a work of great insight and learning. I fear there's little in the many insights of modernity with which I would take direct issue. What I'd like to do instead is twofold. First, to suggest a historical precursor of his analysis, Adam Smith, but a precursor who still has additional insights that seem to me to add to Berger's. And second, I'd like to suggest some emendations of Berger's characterization of contemporary religion, at least in the Western world, by drawing upon his near contemporary Ernest Gellner. Let me turn first to the themes of religious pluralism and political management that run through the book. One of the first thinkers to deal systematically with that theme was Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. I'm aware that in recent years, parts of Smith's analysis of religion have been rediscovered by social scientists who have tried to produce economistic accounts of religion, some of which were cited here this morning. But it seems to me that there are elements of Smith's analysis that are not only precursors of Berger's contentions, but that suggest some refinements of them. In The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, Smith was concerned with the social effects of Christian religious institutions, despite his own skepticism of revealed truth. His most extended exploration of the social functions of religion comes in his discussion of government expenses, quote, for the institutions of the instruction of people of all ages, unquote. Smith's overriding concern was with the role of religion in retarding or promoting public order and public morals, both of which were necessary if the economic and moral benefits of commercial society were to reach the lower orders. Smith examined the major established Christian denominations of his day, the major dissenting churches, and the major sectarian churches, or sectarian sects, and explains their relative successes and failures in terms of the structure of incentives in what might be called the market for souls. That's the part that's received the most attention from recent economistic theories of religious behavior. But Smith was also very concerned with the political management of religious pluralism, which was, after all, a primary concern, perhaps the primary concern, of European political theorists from Hobbes on. Smith presented his analysis of this issue as a rejoinder to David Hume, a man described in the text of The Wealth of Nations as, quote, by far the most illustrious philosopher and historian of the present age, unquote. Hume had argued that in most professions, government needed to play no regulatory role because customers in the market would decide on the quality of the services being offered. But Hume made a major exception in the case of the profession of the clergy, arguing that the very diligence of clergymen could be dangerous, quote, because in every religion except the true, it is highly pernicious, and it has even a natural tendency to pervert the true by infusing into it a strong mixture of superstition, folly, and delusion, unquote. Hume, a religious skeptic, did not believe that the doctrine of the established church was true, but he was deeply concerned with the effects of religion on political order. In order to retain the support of their followers, Hume wrote, preachers of non-established sects would profess, quote, the most violent abhorrence of all other sects, and would propagate doctrines geared to the passions and credulity of the populace. So Hume's recommendation was that in the interests of public order and public morals, the government ought to pay the salaries of established priests, quote, to bribe their indolence. Their function was, quote, merely to prevent their flock from straying in quest of new pastures. Struck by the role of religiously motivated strife in 17th century England, it was the very zeal of clergymen which Hume feared as a source of faction and civil war. The state, according to Hume, ought to fund the established faith in the interests of spiritual quality control and political order. Smith responded with a thought experiment, which began by accepting Hume's goal of civil peace, but suggested a very different mechanism for their realizations. What, he asked, if politicians, quote, dealt equally and impartially with all the different sects, and allowed every man to choose his own priest and as his own to choose as his own priest and as his own religion as he thought proper, unquote. The result, he anticipated, would be, quote, a great multitude of religious sects, unquote, in which each teacher would exert himself to maintain and enlarge the number of his disciples. But the very multiplicity of sects, Smith argued, would curb the negative outcomes that Hume had feared. Here's a quote from Smith on this. The interested and active zeal of religious teachers can be dangerous and troublesome only when there is either but one sect tolerated in the society, or where the whole of a large society is divided into 2 or 3 great sects. But that zeal must be altogether innocent where the society is divided into 200 or 300, or perhaps as many thousand small sects, of which no one could be considerable enough to disturb the public tranquility. End of the quotation. So Smith calls attention to the question of the number of competing religions in any particular society, an issue that I think Peter Berger has overlooked. For looking back at modern Western history, it seems that when the number of permitted or privileged churches is 1, there's a typical spectrum of reactions, from orthodoxy on the one hand, and on the other hand, either anti-clericalism, as in France or Spain or Italy, or simple indifference, as in Scandinavia or now in Britain as well. By contrast, when there are 2 or 3 major competing faiths, the typical pattern has been of confessionalization, which reinforces allegiance to each denomination, as for much of modern Dutch history and for much of modern German history. It seems that as the number of major competitors goes beyond 3, the relativizing effects that Peter Berger is so concerned with seem to take hold. Once there are more competitors for religious allegiance, and especially when there are myriad competitors for religious allegiance, a new dynamic takes hold, as Smith himself predicted. Here's what he wrote. Seeing themselves surrounded on all sides with more adversaries than friends, the preachers of each denomination would become more moderate. So Smith thought that it was the relative weakness of each denomination which would ensure its need to be tolerated by others, and thus create a disposition to tolerate others. The result of the respect for other faiths necessitated by the structure of the situation might even lead each denomination, he theorized, to make, quote, the concessions which they would find it both convenient and agreeable to make to one another, unquote. Ultimately, they would each reduce their doctrine to what he called that pure and rational religion, free from every mixture of absurdity, imposture, or fanaticism, such as wise men have in all ages of the world wished to see established, unquote. So the legislation of zeal and fanaticism might promote toleration, moderation, and rational religion. For Smith, the most beneficent of consequences. Of course, that hasn't always been what happened. No historical prediction is perfect, for as Peter Berger points out, the tacit recognition of the relativity of truth claims can lead to a new sort of fanaticism, and the attempt to create self-enclosed social and cultural circles in which the plausibility of truth claims remain unquestioned. Still, Smith's thought experiment turns out to have been pretty prescient. Smith also had another insight that seems apposite here. Under conditions of religious freedom and denominational competition, different clergy will appeal to a variety of needs, tastes, and dispositions. Some reference has already been made to that idea today. Now, Smith was writing in a period when the expansion of urban manufacture was drawing people from the countryside into the cities. The speed with which these new communities came into being far outstripped the capacity of the established Church of England to adapt. Most parishes at the time had depended financially on paternalistic landowners who weren't to be found in the new urban centers. And so the gap was eventually filled, as Smith describes, by revivalistic Methodists who concentrated their energy on the lower classes and were most successful in the new industrial centers. These sectarian preachers, Smith claimed, were more successful among the lower classes not only because their economic dependence on the contribution of their flock gave them a material incentive to proselytize, but because they delivered a moral and religious message which was more suited to the social needs and intellectual attainments of those lower classes. Those kinds of messages were messages that the established clergy of the Church of England were no longer capable of delivering. The established clergy was too educated. They couldn't talk in good conscience about hell, whereas those of the unestablished dissident sects could talk about fire and brimstone as the expected results of sinful behavior. Smith said that there were, broadly speaking, two systems of morality in society. One that was indulgent and was typical of the upper classes, and one that was strict and was typical of the upwardly aspiring lower classes. Here's what he writes about them. In the liberal or loose system, luxury, wanton, and even disorderly mirth, the pursuit of pleasure to some degree of intemperance, the breach of chastity, at least in one of the two sexes, provided they are not accompanied with gross indecency and do not lead to falsehood or injustice, are generally treated with a good deal of indulgence and are easily either excused or pardoned altogether. In the austere system, on the contrary, those excesses are regarded with the utmost abhorrence and detestation. Smith thought that these moral systems were correlated with economic positions. The rich in general, and particularly people of fashion, tended to favor the loose system. The more successful among the common people, by contrast, tended toward the austere system, because they knew that liberal morals would be, which didn't really harm people of the upper classes, would be disastrous if practiced by them. As Smith puts it, the vices of levity are always ruinous to the common people, and a single week's thoughtlessness and dissipation is often sufficient to undo a poor workman forever and to drive him through despair upon committing the most enormous crimes. The wiser and better sort of the common people, therefore, have always the utmost abhorrence and detestation of such excesses, which their experience tells them are immediately fatal to people of their condition. So Smith argued that the messages preached by the clergy of those denominations seeking to orient themselves to these upwardly aspiring lower classes were quite different from those who preached to the upper classes because of the different moral tastes of their potential flocks. It seems to me that at least some of the attraction of Pentecostalism, to which Peter Berger has devoted a lot of attention in recent years, is to those who aspire to rise from lower class status to middle class status, and can be explained on these grounds. Of course, there are hundreds of patterns of religious taste in advanced industrial societies. What is remarkable is the way in which new faiths, denominations, sects, and covens proliferate to meet these tastes, or to put it in other terms, to capture underserved social and psychological markets. And that brings me from adumbrations to emendations of Berger's theses, for it raises the issue of the way in which beliefs are held. In his chapter on the secular discourse, Peter Berger notes quite rightly that, and this is a quotation, modernity has indeed produced a secular discourse which enables people to deal with many areas of life without reference to any religious definitions of reality. But he goes on to discuss, as he did this morning, that the secular discourse exists both in the subjective minds of individuals who have learned to deal with zones of reality without any supernatural presuppositions, and in the objective order of society, in which specific institutions also function without such presuppositions. So there are areas of consciousness in which individuals allow the secular discourse to determine their approach, for example, how they cope with illness. And as he's pointed out again today, in the experience of most individuals, secularity and religion are not mutually contradictory. They refer to different relevant structures. Yet, the ability to compartmentalize beliefs in this fashion perhaps requires more explanation. And here I think a suggestion made by Ernest Gellner in a talk first published in 1987 seems useful. The talk was called The Rubber Cage: Disenchantment with Disenchantment. Gellner was interested in some of the same phenomena as Peter Berger. He observed that in advanced industrial societies, where people are so dependent upon science, technology, and instrumental rationality for their everyday existence, there was an efflorescence of ideologies that sought to reinfuse the world with intrinsic meaning. And he offered an explanation for why that was the case. He argued that with the growth of affluence and with automation, most of us depend on devices and technologies, the scientific basis of which we don't understand in the least. We can drive a car without understanding the physical and chemical properties that make it possible. We can, to take a more modern example, we can use an iPad or a smartphone by just manipulating a few apps, by pressing a few buttons here and there, without any tangible sense of the physics or technology that make that possible. And thus, Gellner argued, the activities requiring disenchanted, scientific, and technological modes of reasoning, quote, are diminishing, both as a proportion of the population and as a proportion of the time of individuals, while the activities calling only for easy, intuitive, near self-evident responses are increasing. The result, Gellner theorized, was a kind of cognitive separation of powers, with two realms, but here's his characterization that's very different from Peter Berger's. Two realms, one for substance and another for symbolism. Here's how Gellner put it. People think about these issues. Let us leave real cognition in the iron cage. It can be icy, impersonal, abstract, technical, devoid of warmth and magic, impermanent, inaccessible, and unintelligible. For our human life, our conceptualization of ourselves and our relationship with our fellows, let us have something personal, warm, human, intelligible. Let the iron cage of scientific and technological knowledge apply to a perhaps shrinking realm of professional, specialized, and manipulative knowledge. Our expanding leisure time can be spent in a happily re-enchanted world, even if we don't take it too seriously when facing grave decisions involving the real world, like being in the hospital because you're sick. The result of this, Gellner thought, was what he called half-serious belief. And he applied this to a number of contemporary secular belief systems, but also to what he dubbed modernist religion, which he thought was characterized by what he called auto-functionalism and decognitivization. Auto-functionalism amounts to the embrace of beliefs not because they're thought to be true, but because they're thought to be functional or useful. And that goes together with decognitivization, which he called, quote, a ploy, which consists of subtracting the cognitive or doctrinal element from the significance of pronouncements so as to allow them to be valid by some other criterion, unquote. Thus, and here's Gellner again, it is asserted that the real significance of a religious pronouncement is to express a commitment or to celebrate the cohesion of a social group. If so, and if that is all there is to it, it is, of course, a terrible solecism to treat those expressions of commitment or cohesion or whatever as cognitive pronouncements to be subjected to the same tests and so on. In short, Gellner thought, the price of tolerance to which Peter Berger points is a certain degree of indifference, not only to the truth claims of the religion of others, but of one's own religion. Whatever works for you becomes the ultimate maxim, leading to what Philip Rieff, with rather different intentions, dubbed the triumph of the therapeutic. Religion thus becomes another consumption good. Peter Berger's phenomenological approach seeks to recapture the experience of the actor, in this case, the religious actor. Gellner's approach was more rationalist and critical. There's much to be said for both of these approaches, and perhaps the phenomenologist of religion can learn something from the critical rationalist. That's it. Well, a lot of the others, Peter, are in the service sector. The service sector, which after all is bigger than the, manufacturing sector.
In other words, the category would be a non-cage people.
The re-enchanted.
The re-enchanted.
Yes.
The re-enchanted will be on welfare, or they will take care of elderly iron cage technicians, which is not the happy prospect. That's not therapeutic, but I was struck by that. Who pays for whom? Supports whom?
Right, and of course, Gellner's analysis doesn't allow for the kind of person who you cited earlier today, who, on the one hand, believes, is working in oil extraction and needs to know a good deal about the laws of physics, and on the other hand, believes, or at least asserts, that the world was created 6,000 years ago. And of course, the question that he's raising, and that's why I came to it, is what's the status of that latter belief? In other words, how operative a role does it actually play in his life? I'm sure that for some people it's the primary role, but there's a suggestion by Gellner that it's more superficial, it's more of a luxury, and this seems to be at least partly linked to a phenomenon that we haven't discussed much today, and that is the degree of religious switching in the United States, the degree to which people move from one denominational faith to another, not to speak of the degree to which people within any particular denomination move in and out of that denomination in the course of a lifetime. So the question then is, how agreeing that people have these multiple realities or multiple discourses in their own mind, are we still missing something by not thinking about whether some of these beliefs are more serious than others? Again, the ultimate proof would be, or could be, the one that you've cited many times and that Gellner also cites: what you do when you're sick. If you don't go to the hospital, that's an assertion that there are certain kinds of scientific reality that are not as important to you as supernatural realities. And of course, we have some people in our society who do that, but they're pretty small group on the whole. So, uh-huh.
They're free to do so, but not they have to send their kids. So the others are going to come down.
True.
Can I ask you something? We often talk as if exclusivism in relation to truth is it's on the same axis as commitment. But isn't the holding has to be exclusively true on a completely separate axis from degree of commitment? Because empirically, if you go around talking to all sorts of religious people all the time, as I do, there doesn't seem any correlation between people who believe things with certainty, like fundamentalists, and the degree of commitment. So a lot of liberal believers or play-acting believers who may say Wicca, and they say, well, I know it's not really ancient witchcraft, but we're reinventing it, and it's great, and it works for me. Yet they can be just as committed, and it's just as important in their lives, and they seem to last as long, if not longer. They're not necessarily the same things, are they? We sort of conflate them as if the minute you say, my belief may be true, it may be not, somehow they're not committed to it.
Yes.
Exactly. So the conditions of pluralization, which undermine your belief in exclusive certainty of your own belief, needn't impact on the degree of commitment with which you hold that.
Yes, actually, Peter's actually suggested in his book that it may actually increase your degree of commitment because you're aware of the tenuousness of your belief. And so at least you have a commitment to create a social and cultural structure in which your belief isn't called into question. And that requires what some economistic theories of religion call strong religion, where you create strong boundaries. And so in order to recreate your plausibility structure, which is shaken by, which means you have a relatively not full belief in or at least you have some element of doubt because of this relativization. In order to dispel that, as it were, you have to put yourself and your family and your children in a cultural context in which those beliefs are not called into question. So in that sense, doubt can go together with increased commitment.
Yes, but that's a very specific sense. It wasn't quite what I meant. But
Is it possible the degree of commitment is revealed in alternate situations?
yeah.
That
Boundary situation, conflict,
yeah.
property situation.
Or it could be revealed in the amount of dues you're willing to pay to your church or congregation. I don't know.
Everything
Nope.
I've said in this speaking seems to go on forever. Which is fine. I invent it. I felt I said was behind the surgical mask of social scientific objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
I've not introduced my religious or political convictions. But say something very Lutheran, and that is that what's the core formulation of Lutheranism so that people are saved by faith alone? What Luther had in mind, frankly, doesn't interest me very much. It is that sort of anarchistic notion of an angry God who's going to get them to not get this angry God. And frankly, I don't think much about it. So I have a very different notion why sola fide is a very useful and good to think about religion. What is the opposite of faith? It's not lack of belief, it's not unbelief, which preachers over the centuries have said was a sin. No, the opposite of faith is knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting thing.
Yes, as Nietzsche put it, faith is the will not to know.
Well, no, faith is what I don't know. It's committing myself to something that I don't know. And that's, I think, a very interesting way to think about it. I mean, if you want to put it in a non-religious frame of reference, I know you, Jerry, for several years. Do I know that you Do I know this? No. I know there are such people. Maybe you're one of them. I don't think so. I have faith that you are not, because I know you, I trust you. Like something Luther said was faith is fides is fiducia, trust. I think that's very interesting, and that doesn't necessarily reduce commitment. It means living with a certain degree of health. I'm not critiquing anything you said. I'm just stimulated by what you said.
Okay.
Peter's formulation, the thing that his observation provoked was actually the biblical definition of faith, which is actually contrary to sort of what you suggest. In 11th chapter of Hebrews, it says, faith is the evidence of things hoped for. Faith is knowledge. For certain people, faith is in fact knowledge. And so there's a very poetic line in Hebrews, faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen. Faith is the basis and the foundation. The book says, if anyone comes to God, he must first believe that he is, and he will reward those who diligently seek him. The presumption, the presupposition is that, and this is interesting because this is a class thing, going back to your, the strategy, elites versus the poor. For the poor, faith is knowledge because you don't have any existential options. So you invest everything in your faith, and it becomes an epistemological basis for how you even exist. So it's interesting. Depending on where you are on the social ladder, if you're an elite, you got lots of options. So it can be down, existential crisis, I can do Nietzsche today, Kierkegaard tomorrow, it's fine. However, when your entire being, your ontology is dependent upon this decision, faith is not, faith is knowledge, but it affirms the basis for your existence itself, because you come from the lower orders. Life is hanging on a real thin thread. You don't have a lot of options, therefore.
In the passage you quoted from the letter to Hebrews, things not seen could also be understood as things not known.
True. That's one hermeneutic approach. Absolutely.
Are the senses the only way we know?
There we go. No, the answer is that.
If that's the case, you
Okay. So since, thank you. Okay.